What up, y'all? Welcome to episode 5 of Plug Talk. Let's go! On episode 4, we talked about debt. So today we're going to take a little deeper dive into my philosophy on debt and how your debt can actually turn into an asset. Here's my philosophy. There's constructive debt and destructive debt. Constructive debt has the ability to turn into assets. Essentially what that means is you have debt that can turn into cash flow, that can turn into a physical asset. So by you making a specific investment in regards to what area that may be, it can turn into an asset in your life because you chose strategically to move into a level of debt that was going to acquire you something positive and constructive into your life. Destructive debt is essentially the thought process that whatever debt that you're getting into leads down a road of destruction or comes from a realm of destruction. Essentially, you're getting into debt that is not going to lead you down a constructive path. Destructive debt is essentially accumulating debt over time that does not equal an asset or a positive, constructive investment into your life in any way. So I'm not talking about consumerism to where you're able to buy yourself clothes and shoes. I'm talking about your inability to be able to pay off the credit card that you use to acquire that consumer product. That's what I mean by destructive debt. And I'm also not talking about spending money on something on a credit card and then paying it off at the end of the month. I'm talking about debt that lasts for 5 to 30 years that is based out of a destructive place. So that's the difference in my philosophy when it comes to constructive debt and destructive debt. We talked about this a little bit last week. Constructive debt can also be in the form of student loans. Student loans has the ability to put you in places that you wouldn't have been without that education, professionally and network-wise. I'm in spaces because I'm getting my doctoral degree and using student loans to do so that I wouldn't have been in without it. Sure, could I have spent cash in paying for school, but who knows what other strain that would have put on my life, especially with being in a pandemic. But because I decided to take out a student loan to further my education, I can focus right here, right now, just on my education, growing professionally, growing academically, and also growing my network. And then at the same time, I was able to use the cash that I had to acquire more assets. Now, the assets that I have can now pay off the debt that I've accumulated because I've got to a space where you can manage it. So if I'm going to acquire more debt, I need to also figure out a way, how am I going to manage this debt? So you're not moving into things blindly. You're moving into them with a strategic thought process of how is this debt going to get taken care of and what asset can I use to take care of this debt? So that's an example of creating constructive debt. Whether that's buying a property that allows you to acquire an asset, that's constructive debt. Or maybe it is going out and getting your education because you know when you have this degree, you'll be able to make more money and you'd rather have money in your pocket to focus on your degree and then also be able to manage and pay for the rest of your life. Here's an example. Let's say I only had $10,000 to my name and I had $10,000 in student loans. And I said, I want to pay off all of my student loans with this $10,000 and be debt free. And I went out and I did it. Then the next day, somebody said, hey, Reese, I know you're a real estate investor. Would you like to go in on a deal with me? All you need to bring is $10,000 to the table. And what if I just wiped out all of my money? And I can tell them, I don't have the money anymore. I just paid off my student loans. I'm debt free, but it's going to take me another who knows how long to be able to make back up that $10,000. Here's the other side of it. Now, if I had $20,000 and I said, okay, I'm going to pay off that $10,000 and I'm going to keep this $20,000 just in case a situation comes up and somebody wants me to invest. That's different. But not everybody has that much money sitting around where they can say they're going to pay off their debt and save this money for an investment. Again, I'm not talking to millionaires and people who have a whole bunch of money in the bank. I'm talking to everyday people who are trying to get themselves to that space. I'm not saying I'm pro debt, go get yourself in a whole bunch of debt, but if cash is king, you want to make sure you have cash on hand to be able to act when the time is right for you to be able to acquire more assets when those assets can actually pay off some of the other debt in your life. So there's ways that debt can work in your favor. It works in your favor if it's acquiring you an asset and furthering your life, your health, and your physical being. Now, there's ways that you're going to have to think about, how do I make this happen? And that's why you have to get strategic about the entire process and not just go about it uneducated. And here's the great thing about the knowledge of debt. Debt can create assets or debt can take away assets. And that's why it's really important for you to have the knowledge when you're making any moves. Because is the debt that I'm getting into, is it going to be constructive to create assets, or is it going to be destructive to take away assets? And what are assets? Assets is anything that creates cash flow, creates an investment, that creates anything positive coming back to you, and not a liability. So you have assets and you have liability. A liability is essentially something that is not bringing anything to you. It's not providing you any cash flow or any extra money, where an asset has the ability to bring more money to you. Another thought that I want you to think about is when you're making moves that acquire debt accumulation, think about, is the debt that I'm getting into, is this a positive investment? Is this an investment that is going to be one that I can manage? Is this a constructive investment? Is this going to acquire me assets? Is this going to increase my network? Is this going to increase my capital? Or is this actually going to decrease it in a destructive way? So if you have to figure out between making a move or not, ask yourself this question: is it constructive or destructive? Not necessarily am I being a consumer, but is this debt accumulation going to get me closer to the goals that I have, or is it going to get me further away? And that goes in any lines of debt accumulation, because having debt can be really heavy on a lot of people. But you have to think about the ways that you're getting into debt and why you're getting into that debt and why you have so much of the debt that you have. Another positive of debt is that it can increase cash flow. So this might be something to where you think about, is me going and buying this whatever? Is me going to get this education? Is this going to increase the amount of cash flow that comes into my house every single month? If it's going to do that and you're going to get your money back and you like the percentages, take the time to break that down and recognize, if I invest in this thing and I'm acquiring a certain amount of debt, at what percentage rate am I going to get my money back to be able to reuse that money and recycle that money and make my money work for me? Because remember, money just sitting by itself underneath a mattress or in a drawer does nothing for you. Money by itself alone can't do that much, but money leverage can do that much more. Money with good credit can do that much more. And then when you can keep some of your money in your pocket and leverage other people's money because of your credit, now you're in a really good space. Again, I'm not speaking to those who have umpteens amount of money. I'm talking to those who have to be a little bit more strategic, so that way they can accumulate assets and leverage other people's money, which is ultimately debt, in order to be able to do so they can become debt-free in the long run. So you may not be debt-free right here, right now, but if you have the ability to accumulate assets along the way, leveraging debt to be able to become debt-free, that sounds like a win-win situation to me. So remember these concepts. Cash is king and credit is queen. Constructive debt and destructive debt. Assets and liability. So when you're making any move, have those in your mind. This week, I want you to really look at your financial situation and look at, how much king and how much queen do I have? What's that partnership look like? How much constructive debt and how much destructive debt do I have? Is my constructive debt really working for me, or am I being fooled in thinking that it's actually constructive when it's really destructive? Look at the destructive debt. Why do I have this debt? Where did it come from? And can I use some of my constructive debt and assets to pay off the destructive debt that I have? Because remember, debt can either help you acquire more assets, or it can take away assets and your ability to acquire more assets. Because there's a thing that we'll talk about in the future called DTI, and that's your debt to income ratio. So that's one thing, if you're trying to buy a home, that you really need to keep in mind, is your debt to income ratio. And so when it comes to that, your destructive debt has an impact on your ability to move forward and buy more assets. Your constructive debt has the ability to increase your ability to buy more assets, because it's bringing in on both sides of the coin, the debt and the income, while the destructive debt only sits on the debt side. So DTI is debt to income. Constructive debt sits on both sides, while destructive debt only sits on one side. And that's what's going to keep you from being able to acquire more assets, while constructive debt has the ability to bring in more assets and sits on both sides of the coin and can ultimately help you become debt free. The takeaway for this episode is this: constructive debt, destructive debt. Think about it, look at it, and figure out how you can leverage what you already have to get rid of the destructive debt that you have. And any moves that you make sure you're investing in yourself because you're worth it. The task I have for you is to go out, look at your financial situation. We're coming towards the end of the year. Make sure that you're sitting exactly where you want to be, so that way you can move where you want to go in 2021. Thank you for tapping in to Plug Talk Tuesdays. I'm Coach Reese. Let's grow.